With the announcement over 2 months ago now that we would be getting a game adaptation of the first Fazbear Frights story, Into the Pit, I think there's going to be a decent amount of people who don't read the books that want to know what the story is about. In the back half of Fazbear Frights, I started doing summaries of the stories, but I never made one for Into the Pit, so in this video, I decided to read Into the Pit for the third time, do a full summary of the story, note any interesting details that may be important to the game or the story of FNaF overall, then I'm going to discuss a couple interesting details from the graphic novel, and I'm also going to be giving you all the background information about the story regarding its connections to other Frights stories and how the pit works. So if you're someone who wants to know the story before the game comes out, this is the place for you. But without further ado, let's get started. Into the Pit begins with the main character of Oswald in the car with his dad, pointing out a dead possum on the road that has been there since yesterday. Oswald was a 10-year-old kid who lived in a town that was basically dead with not very many people still living there and many buildings being dusty and abandoned. 3 years ago, there'd been a mill in the town that employed a lot of people, but it shut down, causing lots of unemployment. The town died down immensely and a lot of people moved away, including Oswald's best friend, Ben. Oswald and his family weren't very well off. His dad had a belly and used to work at the mill before it shut down, now working at a place in town called the Snack Space. Today was Oswald's last day of school before the summer, but he wasn't particularly excited about the summer. Since Ben had already left town, Oswald didn't have anyone to hang out with. School and even home were already boring, but summer wouldn't be much better. His dad told him how when he was a kid, he wouldn't end up at home during the summer until dinner, and he told Oswald that he should have fun over his summer, but that was easier said than done. At school, the bully named Dylan, as usual, referred to him as Oswald the Ocelot, and the students had been allowed to bring electronics to school because it was the last day. Unfortunately, Oswald didn't have anything outside of his very old, out-of-date phone that he didn't want people seeing, so instead he just started drawing at school. For some reason, he'd recently been drawing robotic bears, bunnies, and birds that were furry on the outside but had mechanical skeletons on the inside. He wasn't sure why. He was immersed in his drawing until the teacher turned off the lights and played a very childish movie. At recess, a lot of the kids talked about what they'd be doing over summer break, which was much more than the nothing Oswald would be doing because his family didn't have enough money for him to be doing stuff like what other kids would be doing. All he'd do is play video games, draw, and go to the library. Alone. His dad suggested during dinner that he take him to the library on his way to work every day, and that he can go to Jeff's Pizza for a slice and a soda. Oswald thought Jeff's Pizza was weird. It clearly used to be something more popular, but now it was kind of just run down with a lot of unused space, a stage for no performers, and missing letters on the menu. Still, the pizza was good, and it was pretty much the only pizza place around since the others had closed down not long after the mill did. That night, Oswald and his dad watched an old bad CGI Japanese horror movie called Zendrelix vs. Mecha Zendrelix, clearly an allusion to Godzilla. When he went to bed, he hoped for the best that something interesting would happen. He woke up the next morning and said hi to his mom, who worked from 12 p.m. to 12 a.m., so he didn't see her too often during the week. They talk a bit about the lack of Ben, and she tells him it's possible that someone will move here, though that was unlikely since the town was pretty dead, but someone cool might already live here without him knowing. Oswald doubted it and just ate breakfast, later going to the library, which was actually a bit of fun as he had found the newest book in a sci-fi series he liked, as well as an interesting looking manga. Later on, he went to Jeff's Pizza, which was as weird as he remembered it being. There were tables and booths, but it was mostly just empty space, which was like a dance floor, but nobody danced there, and the walls seemed to be painted over murals with cheap paint since you could see the shapes of what was underneath barely peeking through. There was also the unused stage, as well as a roped off ball pit that was filled with dust, and the colors of the balls were faded due to the age of the pit. There was a sign on it that said, "Do not use." It was weird. But what was weirder was Jeff himself, a man who looked much older than he probably was, had bloodshot eyes with dark bags under them, dark hair sticking up weirdly, and this made him look like he hadn't slept in days. His apron was stained with tomato sauce that was probably very old and very new. He was the only one working there, but not enough people were there at any given time that this was a problem. After Oswald ate his very large slice of pizza, he sat reading for about 2 hours before Jeff offered him a few extra slices that didn't sell at lunch. Since he'd have to throw them away anyway, he gave them to Oswald for free and also got him more orange soda. He was being really nice despite the fact that his expression always remained the same, emotionless. Once he finished his pizza and soda, Oswald got a text from his dad that he was almost there to pick him up. Surprisingly, it had been a good day. That lasted a couple weeks, but eventually doing this every day started to get really boring. One night, he and his family had what they called a family fun night. Before the mill closed down, it was always something like going out for dinner, watching movies and stuff like that. But nowadays, it was just like a picnic or a stay-at-home thing like tonight, where Oswald and his dad argued over whether the remake or the original version of the movie that they'd been watching was better. That night, Oswald texted Ben about their summers and found that Ben was having a way more fun time than Oswald was. Ben commented that Jeff's pizza was creepy. Considering that and the library was pretty much all Oswald was doing, it was pretty sad, and they wished they were hanging out together. The next morning in the car with his dad, he kinda just exploded, going off about how every day is the same and how Ben's life is so much better than theirs. He accused his dad of throwing him out on the street like garbage every day, and eventually hopped out of the car to avoid his dad's further criticism. He wasn't in a good mood for the rest of the day. At Jeff's Pizza, he realized he agreed that it was creepy. Not only the pizza place itself, but also Jeff, who looked like he was a 100-year-old zombie pizza chef, but was probably like 30. Oswald decided today would be different though. Today, he was gonna hide in the ball pit and his dad would have to come and find him, and so he hopped into the pit. The balls in the pit were sticky and dusty, and his mother's voice telling him ball pits would give him pink eye filled his head. Still, he sat in the pit for a bit more before the dust made him sneeze enough that he didn't want to be in there anymore. He went up for air, but when he did, he found that he was not in Jeff's Pizza. Around him were a lot of kids and parents, many old arcade machines like Miss Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, a stage with a robotic bear, bunny, and chicken that reminded him of his recent drawings but creepier, as well as the murals on the wall that were also in Jeff's Pizza, only now they weren't painted over. The words Freddy Fazbear's Pizza were at the bottom of the mural, and the ball pit was no longer roped off. The whole place was sensory overload with a bunch of beeps and electronic noises, and the people around him had styled and fluffy hair and outfits and colors people wouldn't be caught dead in nowadays. Oswald was still in the building Jeff's Pizza was in, but it was instead what the building was before Jeff took over. Oswald stood, admiring the pizzeria, when someone bumped into him. He felt the impact, but he couldn't decide whether that was a bad thing or a good thing, because he meant this was probably not a dream. The kid who bumped into him seemed to be about Oswald's age, and introduced himself as Chip after apologizing. He pointed out how he hadn't seen Oswald before, and so Oswald made up a story about how he was visiting for a few weeks and staying with his grandma, but he said this place was great with all these old games and such. Chip interrupted him when he referred to these as old games, as these were apparently the newest games out at this time. Chip then pointed out his friend Mike and asked Oswald if he wanted to go play skee-ball with them, and they did. As Oswald followed Chip and Mike to the skee-ball area, he noticed a yellow rabbit walk past them. Considering no one else seemed to notice, he thought it was probably just a Freddy's employee dressed up to entertain the kids. Oswald, Chip, and Mike played skee-ball for a few games before Oswald started to worry about what time it actually was. He told Chip and Mike his grandma was about to pick him up, almost letting the word text slip out of his mouth before realizing they'd have no idea what he was talking about, and then thought for a second about how to get out of here. He decided to hop back into the ball pit when no one was looking, and when he rose out of it again, he was back in Jeff's Pizza, and his shoes were right where he left them, right outside the pit. He checked his phone and saw a text from his dad saying he'd be there to pick him up in 2 minutes. No time had passed when he was in the pit, and as he walked out the door, Jeff called out, "See ya, kid." The next day, he was in a good mood, unlike the previous day due to his excitement to hop back into the pit. When he did, he was able to pinpoint the year from a calendar in an open office. It was 1985. He met up with Chip and Mike again. Mike was wearing a Back to the Future shirt and called Oswald Oz, likening it to the Wizard of Oz. Considering how boring Oswald's summer was previously, he was glad he now had actual friends, not to mention the nickname, whether it was in 1985 or not. They offered him pizza and they played games like yesterday, but Oswald also noticed the yellow rabbit thing in the corner of the pizzeria. He wondered why it would do that if it worked for the pizzeria, since it was pretty creepy, but since Chip and Mike ignored him, he did too. As they ate their pizza, Mike mentioned how much he used to love Freddy's, even having a stuffed Freddy he'd sleep with as a little kid, but now the animatronics are just creepy to him. They compared it to stuff like clowns or dolls, things that you like as kids being creepier when you get older. Oswald wanted to mention the yellow rabbit, but decided against it. They played some more games, and Oswald thanked them for sharing their tokens and leaped back into the pit when no one was looking. Doing this became a normal thing. We skip ahead to another day where they mostly talk about movies and how Oswald basically doesn't know any movies that came out in 1985. All he could think of that came out in the 80s was E.T., but apparently 3-year-old movies are too old in the eyes of kids from 1985. I don't even want to know what they'd say if he brought up Star Wars. When Chip and Mike got up to play games, Oswald wanted to sit back. He didn't like that he was always leeching off their money because he didn't have any, but they really hadn't minded. He didn't want to continue doing that, so he decided to just hang out with them while they played. But when he stood up, he felt a heaviness in his pockets, and he reached in to find a bunch of Freddy Fazbear game tokens. He had no idea how they got there, and the other two looked confused, but they decided to go play the games with those tokens. The next day, Oswald asked his dad how old he was in 1985, to which he responded saying that he was a couple years older than Oswald was now. Oswald asked about Jeff's Pizza and how it used to be some kind of arcade, and his dad's voice sounded weird when he said that it was, but it closed. They made it to the library, and his dad seemed relieved that he didn't have to answer any more questions. It was weird, but it got much weirder really quickly. Oswald went to Jeff's Pizza as he always did, and hopped into the ball pit. He heard sounds around him, but they weren't the usual sounds he heard at Freddy's. He was hearing screams, crying children, and people were yelling for help and running. The restaurant was full of chaos. Oswald was worried for his friends, but he was burning with curiosity about what was going on, even though he knew it had to be bad. But he wasn't even born yet, so he hoped he wasn't in danger. Oswald walked in the opposite direction of everyone else, and he made it to a door that said, "Private." The yellow bunny stood at the door. Then he went inside, and Oswald followed. It was a long, dark corridor, and the bunny was staring at him the whole time, with blank eyes and a smile that never changed. The bunny was leading him to a party room, beckoning for Oswald to go inside. He went in, and inside was half a dozen children with party hats on their heads, lined up against the wall. None of the children were older than Oswald, but all of them were dead. Oswald didn't know how they died, but he knew the rabbit was responsible, and it wanted Oswald to see, for a reason Oswald didn't know. Oswald screamed and ran as the rabbit lunged at him. He ran across the empty arcade, police sirens sounding outside, and leaped back into the pit. The first thing he heard was Jeff's voice when he rose out of the pit. For some reason, time had passed this time. Oswald's dad stomped towards him, asking what he was doing hiding in there. He asked if he'd heard him calling him. He started to mention Oswald's mom when suddenly a pair of yellow arms reached out of the pit and pulled Oswald's dad in. The struggle was cartoonish, but terrifying, as Oswald's dad disappeared into the pit as the yellow rabbit leaped out, adjusting his purple bow tie and turning towards Oswald. The rabbit grabbed Oswald and guided him towards the exit. All the while, Jeff acted like nothing was wrong, simply saying, "See you later." The rabbit got Oswald outside and into the car. Oswald was understandably freaking out. Somehow, the rabbit knew how to drive. Oswald asked what he did and where he was taking him, but the rabbit just kept looking forward, not responding to anything, and driving all the way to Oswald's house. Oswald tried to run once the car door unlocked, but the rabbit was somehow right in front of him, grabbing him and escorting him into Oswald's house while Oswald was screaming about how this was kidnapping. Oswald's cat Jinx was able to decipher that this thing was definitely not normal, and she hissed and ran away to hide. Oswald had never seen her scared or unfriendly before, so if she thought it was bad, it was really bad. Oswald tried to tell the rabbit that this was kidnapping and that his mom would be home soon and call the cops, but he knew it wasn't true, and his mom wouldn't be home for a while. He didn't know if he'd be alive when his mom got home, or even if his dad was alive now. Oswald slowly backed away towards his room, and the rabbit strangely let him do so. He slammed the door shut, and he could hear Jinx growling under his bed. Oswald knew he couldn't escape through the window in his room as it was too high and too small, and the rabbit would hear him if he made a call, so he texted his mom telling her that something was wrong with Dad and that she needed to come home. Before long, his mom called him, but he told her that he couldn't talk after she asked if she needed to call 911. Then she told him that she was on her way home, and a very long 15 minutes later, she arrived with a knock at Oswald's door. Oswald reiterated that something was wrong with Dad, but his mom told him that she just saw his dad. He was on his bed watching TV, and had even made Oswald dinner. Oswald was confused. He told his mom that if Dad was okay, he was too. His mom was a bit concerned and told him that it was probably good that school was starting again soon. Oswald trusted that his mom was right, apologizing for texting her at work for what really wasn't an emergency, even though he thought it was one, and she understood and went back to work. Oswald decided to get some rest since the first day of school was actually tomorrow, but Jinx was still under the bed, terrified, and she wouldn't come out. Oswald lay awake for hours trying to decipher what he'd seen, thinking he probably just imagined it, but eventually he managed to get a few hours of sleep. The next morning, Oswald was sitting at the table for breakfast when suddenly, the yellow rabbit walked into the room and sat across from Oswald. Oswald's heart rate increased as he asked his mom where his dad was, and she got frustrated as she told him that his dad was right across from him, and that if he was joking, he better stop. Oswald excused himself to go get ready for school, and eventually had to get driven to school by his dad, or rather, what everyone else thought was his dad. In the car ride to school, Oswald asked the rabbit if he was real or if this was all in his head, but the rabbit never responded and continued driving. When he made it to school, he told the rabbit not to pick him up after school. The first person Oswald saw in the hall after that was Dylan the bully, who showed up to call him names again while Oswald told him that he had much bigger problems today and walked away. He couldn't concentrate at all in class, despite the fact that normally he was a pretty good student. Later on in the day, he was sitting on a bench lost in thought when a girl with curly black hair and big brown eyes asked if she could sit on the bench, and Oswald said she could. She opened up a big book and started reading, but after a few minutes, she asked Oswald how long he'd gone to this school for. They struck up a conversation and Oswald asked what she's reading. She was reading about Greek mythology and about brave heroes that needed to fight monsters. She read this when she needed to be brave to remind herself that no matter what she was going through, she never had to battle a monster. This resonated with Oswald as he actually did have to figure out how to battle a monster and needed to be brave as well. The girl was having her first day at this new school and her third day in this new town and didn't know anyone yet, which is why she needed to be brave. Oswald took this opportunity to introduce himself, and the girl introduced herself as Gabrielle. Oswald didn't know why, but this was the conversation he needed right now. After school, he treated everything like it was normal, doing chores, trying his best not to run away since he knew the rabbit would always get him, eating dinner across from the yellow rabbit which didn't eat anything, and pretending to read and trying to do his homework. The rabbit had continued to do everything Oswald's dad would normally do, like vacuum and make dinner and even sleep. After dinner, Oswald poured a bowl of milk and put it under his bed for Jinx to have, as she hadn't moved from under there. Oswald couldn't focus on his homework as he was thinking a lot about the rabbit and his dad. At first, he had thought the rabbit was a guy in a suit, but now he was wondering if it was a sophisticated animatronic or even an actual giant rabbit. He also wondered if his dad was in 1985 Freddy Fazbear's right now, or if he was actually dead, but he couldn't think like that. The only way to know for sure, though, was to go back into the pit, so when it was dark, he snuck out of the house. He passed by his parents' bedroom to see the open eyes and huge unchanging grin of the yellow rabbit lying down in bed and staring at the ceiling, or at least that's what it looked like since his eyes didn't close. He passed the room and went out the door as quietly as possible. He ran all the way to Jeff's Pizza, and people stared at him because the way he was running seemed more like something was chasing him, and for all he knew, it could be. It took a while to get to Jeff's Pizza, but he eventually made it, and luckily it was still open. He asked Jeff for an orange soda, and Jeff told him he'd get a pizza out of the oven and then he'd get it for him. When he knew Jeff couldn't see him, Oswald ran over and dove into the pit. He counted to 100 as he normally did when he jumped into the pit, though he didn't think it did anything. But before he was going to get out, he felt something in there with him. It was a person in there. He felt the boots, the ankles, the shoulders, the chest, and the face. It was his dad, and he was alive. He grabbed his dad and struggled, but managed to begin to pull him out of the pit, and he was surprised when he got out of the pit to find that he wasn't in Freddy's. Instead, he was still just in Jeff's Pizza. Suddenly, Oswald could feel a presence behind him, and then a pair of yellow arms gripped him. He managed to free an arm and elbowed the rabbit to free himself, but he was still in the pit, and the rabbit was blocking his exit. He charged at the rabbit to try and knock it under the surface of the pit, and it was knocked into the ropes around the pit, but it then lunged towards Oswald. Its jaw unhinged, revealing double rows of super sharp fangs, and tried to bite Oswald in the neck. Oswald blocked the attack with his arm, and the fangs were plunged into that arm. Oswald used his other arm and punched the rabbit in the face. It then switched focus to Oswald's dad, and Oswald continued to fight the thing to protect his dad from it. Oswald jumped onto the rabbit's back, but then was thrown into the pit, but when he got up out of the pit, he found that the rabbit had gotten tangled in the ropes and netting surrounding the pit. It looked as if it was trying to get help because it was suspended in mid-air somehow, with a rope tied around its neck, its mouth opening and closing repeatedly as if it were gasping for air, despite no sound coming out. A few seconds later, it was completely still. Now what was hanging from the ropes was just an empty rabbit costume, an empty husk of what it previously was. Oswald's dad woke up, completely unaware of anything that just happened, and Oswald knew he couldn't tell him what actually happened. After all, he didn't want to spend years in therapy. Instead, he told his dad that he'd hidden in the pit to prank him and that he hit his head and lost consciousness when he was looking for him. He apologized and his dad forgave him. He also commented on how this ball pit was a safety hazard and how Jeff should get rid of it, doubling down when he saw the cut on Oswald's arm, which Oswald said was a scrape from when he tried to get him out of the pit. Interestingly, Oswald's dad was able to see the empty rabbit hanging and asked what it was, and Oswald truthfully told him that he had no idea. Jeff was still in the kitchen and apparently hadn't seen or heard anything that just happened. Oswald told his dad he loved him, his dad said the same, and they make fun of each other's tastes in science fiction and music and ice cream as they leave Jeff's Pizza with Jeff calling behind them telling Oswald that he left his soda. And that's the end of the first Fazbear Frights story, Into the Pit. But although we're done the summary, there's still quite a bit more that we need to talk about regarding this story, such as the first thing, the connection to the epilogues and how the pit works. In the 8th Fazbear Frights epilogue, we follow Jake and Larson in the aftermath of the incident with Afton, where Jake meets a drug addict and tries to help her while Larson is strangely having visions of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But these visions aren't just visions, they feel real, as if he's actually there. He could even feel the beat of the music around him. It was like he was experiencing a memory, but he knew it wasn't one of his own memories. But in between these visions, he saw one thing. A ball pit. He does some investigating and discovers Jeff's Pizza, a business in the same building Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was in, and also discovers the ball pit, which was covered in dust and blood. He collects samples of this blood, sends it to get tested when it's revealed that there are 30 different samples of blood that had aged in different ways. Each sample of blood is from the same person, but it originated from 30 different years. Not consecutive years, but different years. He does more digging and discovers that Freddy's was bought out by numerous different businesses, but that they all sold it quickly due to the bad history, and it ended up as Jeff's Pizza. In the later epilogues, we learn that the ball pit is where Eleanor stores the spirits of her victims, and the memory of their deaths are in each ball. The final epilogue shows Millie from Count the Ways, and Jake turns her bad memory into a happy one, and one of the balls in the pit lights up. Then, as Jake helps more of the victims, the rest of them do too. The ball pit is not time travel. It's the memories of incidents Eleanor caused or was involved in, the most prominent one being the missing children incident, whether because Eleanor was created from it or if she grew powerful from it. It was the inciting incident for Eleanor as we know her, and that's why it's where Oswald ended up in Into the Pit. It's also worth mentioning that at the end of Into the Pit, Spring Bonnie ends up dying and becoming an empty husk, just like how Eleanor dies in the final epilogue, as an empty husk. This further proves that Eleanor is responsible for Into the Pit, showing that this version of Spring Bonnie was Eleanor's doing. Something else that's interesting is the fact that both Larson and Oswald were reached out to by the pit before ever seeing it. Larson has visions of it, and Oswald starts drawing Freddy Fazbear's characters without ever seeing them. Basically, the ball pit lures people in. Also, when Oswald gets into the pit, it's noted that the balls are sticky, meaning the blood is already there. There's a few other connections to Fazbear Frights stories with Into the Pit, one of which being Find Player 2. In Find Player 2, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza shuts down due to missing kids, and 10 years later it transforms into Flo's Fabulous Eatery. This matches with what we know about Freddy's in the Stitch line, transforming into multiple different locations, so it makes sense if Flo's is one of them. There's two other things mentioned in this story that also connect to other stories, the first being the mill. The mill is a big plot point in the story, being the reason Oswald's town is so dead. It's basically something that employed many people in the town, so when it shuts down, lots of people started having money troubles or moved out of the town. Oswald's family was hit hard due to his father losing his job at the mill. In the story He Told Me Everything, it is also mentioned that a steel mill in town shut down many years ago, seeming to connect He Told Me Everything with Into the Pit. That in turn likely connects the puppet carver due to Fazgoo. That's right, Fazgoo is likely part of the Stitch line, but what's worse is the possibility that Fazgoo could be in the game's timeline too. Not only did Oswald's dad lose his job because of the mill shutting down, but he also got a new part-time job at the Snack Space. The Snack Space is something mentioned 2 other times in the series, once in Room for One More, and also in the Pizzaplex in Security Breach. On top of that, there's quite a few implications that Room for One More is a part of the game's timeline as well, most especially the fact that Stanley in the story never interacts with the Fun Times outside of his nightmares, and his job is to make sure that nothing ever gets out. This seems to indicate that the story takes place after the events of Sister Location, after Ennard has already escaped, and Stanley has to make sure nothing else, such as the mini Renas or Biddy Babs, do too. There's also a mention of a loud banging noise on the walls, which we can also hear on night 1 of Sister Location when returning from Circus Gallery. However, there's one more thing that I want to talk about with this story, and it's something that I talked about quite a long time ago, and I don't know if it means anything, but I wanted to mention it because why not? At the end of Into the Pit, Spring Bonnie bites Oswald's arm. Keep that in mind. In the first story of the first book, there is damage to an arm. But if we move over to the next book, in Lonely Freddy, Alec tears off the arm of the Yarg Foxy. In the second story of the second book, there is damage to an arm. In The New Kid, Devin's arm gets bitten by Golden Freddy. In the third story of the third book, an arm is damaged. It's a very strange element of a bunch of stories, and it also appears in stuff like Bunny Call and most prominently Step Closer. It's a very random connection, but it's in a bunch of stories and I don't know if it's intentional. It honestly probably isn't, but it's just something I noticed and I wanted to bring up. But there's a few other things in this story that I'd like to discuss. Oswald asks his dad at one point how old he was in 1985, and he says that he was a bit older than Oswald is now. This checks out, since it's also mentioned that the arcade games at Freddy's are ones that he knows his dad used to play. However, after that, Oswald asks what happened at that location, and his dad simply says, it closed. Given his blunt response, he very clearly knows what happened, and since this is the town of the original missing children incident, which was a huge event, he obviously would. Because of how popular Freddy's was, his dad definitely would have gone there when he was a kid. So, bearing all that in mind, since Into the Pit is about memories being stored in the pit, it's possible that the one whose memory this was actually Oswald's dad. However, there's one other idea for what this could be. At the end of the final epilogue, we see Jake enter the memory of Millie from Count the Ways. This is important because it means the memories in the pit are the memories of the victims, in which case Oswald likely isn't in the memory of his dad because his dad wasn't a victim. But then, whose memory could it have been? Well, there's one other character who is a victim of William Afton, whose death we don't actually have a clue about, not to mention it is a victim who is heavily connected with Eleanor as their agony is entangled. What if in Into the Pit, Oswald is experiencing the memory of Andrew? The missing children incident here is slightly different as the memory is a bit warped, causing the kids to appear dead outside of the animatronics, which isn't how it went down in the games, but it's possible Afton lured Andrew to the stuffed animatronics and, unlike Oswald, he didn't escape. That's why this Spring Bonnie, who is only the memory of of Afton follows Oswald out into the world because it has to fulfill the memory of Andrew dying. All this is speculation, but I think it actually offers a really good explanation of how Andrew died, being killed alongside the missing children, but not as a part of the missing children incident. It's actually also possible that Oswald being the stand-in for Andrew in this memory and surviving is like what Jake does. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes the memory of it. Hell, maybe that's why Andrew was able to be freed in the epilogues. His memory has already been made into a happy one. Ish. Moving on from that though, there's a few details here that are important to note for the game. First off, the murals on the walls of the Freddy characters that were painted over are still barely visible in Jeff's Pizza, and they also appear on the wall in the trailer for the Into the Pit game when Oswald's dad is pulled into the pit. There's also the fact that Oswald watches Zendrelix, a Godzilla ripoff, and in his bedroom from the Into the Pit game, you can see a Godzilla poster on the wall. What's also worth noting is that Into the Pit takes place in the summer, yet there's a calendar in the trailer marked in October. This could be a change made for the game, but it would be a bit weird since it being in summer is the motivation for the entire story. If you look at the calendar though, the circled date actually matches the date the FNaF movie came out in the calendar for 2023, so it could just be a reference to that. It's unclear. And finally, there's two things I want to mention in the graphic novel of the book. The graphic novels of the Silver Eyes trilogy and the Fazbear Frights books often get some things wrong, but sometimes there's things in the art that are worth noting to me. The art isn't necessarily canon though, as the artists do have free will, but the scripts for the books are provided, so they are intentional, and I'd say that they are usable as evidence, especially if it's something new that wasn't mentioned in the original book, which I'd say is probably used to try and prove something or correct a misunderstanding. In the epilogues, a lot of people misinterpreted the 30 blood samples being from 30 different years as being from 30 consecutive years, which isn't necessarily true, but people use this to place the stitch rate that blogs as well as Into the Pit in 2015, 30 years after the missing children incident. The stitch rate that blogs cannot be in 2015 since they're after FNAF 6, but what about Into the Pit? Technically it could be, as those 30 different years could have been consecutive, but there's no reason it has to be, and because the blood is already there in Into the Pit, even if it was 30 consecutive years, Into the Pit would still be after that, and so it wouldn't really matter and wouldn't have to be in 2015. However, the graphic novel now seems to have corrected this. Oswald mentions the 2020 remake of Zendrelix, and now it's finally available for streaming, which places this story in 2020 at the earliest. I've also heard people say that 2020 and or 2023 are mentioned in codes or something of stuff for the Into the Pit game, which furthers that point, but I'm not as well versed in looking into files and code, so I'll leave you to discuss that with someone else. But that's everything you should probably know about Into the Pit before the game comes out. If in the future we get another game about a FNAF book, I'll do another video like this, but in the meantime, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, but I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!